Hi, my name is Yolanda, and I am going to be talking to you about your upcoming Cuba trip. Now, in this video, I'm going to talk about the history of Cuba. I'm also going to talk about Americans traveling to Cuba. And at the end, I'm going to give you some small phrases that you can use, hopefully, to enhance your trip in Cuba or to Cuba and enhance your interaction with the people of Cuba. All right, let's get started. Havana is the capital of the Republic of Cuba. It was founded in 1519 and became the capital in 1607. The current population is over 2.1 million people. Just wanted to make sure that during this segment of the video, I go over the travel situation for the American citizens going to Cuba. Now, tourism is prohibited by the United States government for the American people trying to go to Cuba. There are 12 categories in which a United States citizen can go to Cuba, and you would have actually had to have selected one of these 12 reasons when purchasing your ticket or your airline ticket. One of the things that I want to mention is what our government actually says about those 12 categories, or about the category that we've selected. If you are going to Cuba with Just Tripping Travelers Club, you would have selected people-to-people educational exchange as the reason why you are traveling to Cuba. And our government basically says travelers utilizing this authorization must be accompanied by a person subject to the U.S. jurisdiction who is a representative of the sponsoring organization. Now, as far as that sponsoring organization, a person subject to U.S. jurisdiction who is an employee, paid consultant, agent, or other representative of a sponsoring organization must accompany each people-to-people educational group traveling to Cuba to ensure that each traveler has a full-time schedule of educational exchange activities. Now, that was one of the last restrictions put on Cuba that, had people a little worried, like, what is the new change? What is the restriction? Well, the restriction is that you can no longer go to Cuba on an individual people-to-people educational exchange. You must go as a group. Travelers utilizing this general license must ensure they maintain a full-time schedule of educational exchange activities intended to enhance contact with the Cuban people, support civil society in Cuba, or promote the Cuban people's independence. And that will result in meaningful interaction between the traveler and the individuals in Cuba. The prominent portion of the activities must not be with a prohibited official of the government of Cuba or a prohibited member of the Cuban Communist Party. I wanted to mention the banking situation in Cuba. Now, I mentioned the embargo in the first segment today. There are no U.S. banks in Cuba that you can go and use your ATM machine at. So if you have a Cuban account, or excuse me, if you have your account at a Cuban bank, you're free to go to their ATM machines. If you don't, like I don't, you're going to have to bring cash with you to Cuba. One of the other things that we have to purchase is a visa. When we get to the airport, we're going to have to purchase a visa for visitation to Cuba. Now, depending on your airline, that cost will fluctuate between $50 and $100. You may need to contact your airline to find out how much your visa to visit Cuba is. And you can let them know that you're going on the people-to-people educational exchange. How much is that visa? I know my ticket is with Delta, and so Delta is charging $50. So you will need to, again, contact them before you get to the airport and get a surprise. One other thing that I wanted to mention is once we get on the plane, you're going to have to fill out a duty form. And with that form, they're going to ask you for your passport information. They're going to ask you what address you're staying at in Cuba, among a couple of other things. Like, how long are you staying? What is the purpose? There are a couple of other questions. The reason why I point this out is because the address that you will use is listed on the itinerary that is being sent out to you. That's the address you'll use for where you're going to be staying at in Cuba. Now, you will need to keep this document with you, because when we leave the country, we'll also need to have that for our airline ride. So keep up with that. Be expecting that. They will hand you out that form on the plane so that you'll have it when you land and have it completed. Let's jump right into the history of Cuba. Now, I'm not going to go all the way back to when dinosaurs roamed the earth, but I will go back to 1492. Christopher Columbus stopped by. He reported back what he saw to Spain. They sent soldiers in to Cuba, and the indigenous people who didn't die from battle died from the disease carried from the Spanish soldiers. And they basically wiped the island clean of any Aboriginal groups. They all died from battle or the disease. Well, after conquering Cuba, they started importing Africans as slaves, and they also had indentured servants come in to do the manual labor for the crops, such as sugarcane, tobacco, and there were some other ones, but they were the #1 producer of sugar. So that went on for a couple of hundred years. And at the end of the 1700s, there was a French and Indian War. And during the French and Indian War, Britain actually seized control of Cuba from Spain. Well, the next year in the Treaty of Paris, Britain gave Cuba back to Spain because Spain gave Florida to Britain. That was their deal. It was about 100 years after that, slavery was abolished in Cuba, and that came right after the 10-year bloody war between Spain and Cuba. They were constantly fighting to get their freedom from Spain. And actually the United States stepped in to help make that happen. After Spain was gone, the United States set up companies in Cuba and were operating in Cuba and working with the Cuban government at the time. Well, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro seized the Cuban government. He was aided with his military strategist Che Guevara. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He's a very influential individual, and you can actually look up videos and documentaries on Che Guevara. And after that, Fidel decided literally like that next year, he went ahead and he nationalized all of those U.S. companies without paying those companies. So basically he turned those companies into Cuban companies and was operating them. Well, after he did that, the United States wasn't too happy. So what they did was they created an embargo against Cuba. So when we go down there, you're going to see the impact of that embargo. It's almost going to be like we stepped into a time capsule with the cars from the 1950s. It's going to be an interesting sight to see for sure. So after that, the United States had an invasion called the Bay of Pigs, which was against Cuba. And then, now this is during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So then we had the Cuban Missile Crisis that went on. And after that, with all of that going on around that time, in 1976 to like 1988, Cuba actually sent troops to go help out Angola. Unbelievable, right? Like they have so much going on at this time. The troops came back home in 1988. Now, during this time, there were still some things going on between Cuba and the United States. There were some times where the United States did send like aid to Cuba to help with humanitarian efforts. But in 1996, the United States government stepped up that embargo. It actually included sanctions against countries, companies, and individuals that aided or did commerce or business with Cuba. 2008, Fidel Castro steps down from power and he gives it over to his brother Raul. And during this time, Cuba still has ties with Russia and China. So with all that being said, they also found if they have oil in Cuba, just to let you know that too. And of course, everybody has heard about those Cuban cigars. So they are still producing those. In 2016, Fidel Castro actually dies. And the country declares 9 days of national mourning because of their loss. Well, in 2017, the United States government made some more changes to the agreement that is currently existing between the United States and Cuba. Washington ended its long-standing policy which grants Cuban immigrants the right to remain U.S. citizens without a visa. So they used to be able to land here. If they landed unsure, then they, were able to stay, but they stopped that. The policy enhances travel restrictions to better enforce the statutory ban on the United States tourism to Cuba. So we are not allowed as American citizens to go to Cuba as tourists. Among other changes, travel for non-academic educational purposes will be limited to just group travel. So you won't be able to go as an individual and do the people-to-people educational exchange. The self-directed individual travel permitted by the Obama administration will be prohibited. Cuban Americans will still be able to continue to visit their family in Cuba and send them money. So that's what I have for Cuba's history. And just one more tidbit is I didn't mention that Havana, which is where we'll be flying into, is actually the capital of Cuba. Thank you so much. And we're going to move on to our next segment. Hey, I just wanted to give you a couple of tidbits on some key phrases that you can learn before we head off to Cuba. Now, my Spanish is not great, but it has gotten me by. Your Spanish doesn't have to be perfect either. People appreciate the fact that you are trying. So, if you just make the attempt, it will be well received. The other thing is a lot of times when you go outside of the country, people are often looking for an opportunity to speak English. So just try it. Now, one of the things that, we want to start off with are greetings. So you want to say hola, that means hello. Buenos dias is good morning. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Buenas noches, good evening. ¿Cómo está? How are you doing? And then I would actually respond, bien, gracias. So good, thank you. And you can return and say ¿cómo está to the other person, or you can say y usted, which is and you. Our please and thank yous. So how do you say please? Por favor. Thank you is gracias. When you are introduced to somebody, here we would say nice to meet you. There we're going to say mucho gusto. Instead of saying you're welcome, you can say me gusta or de nada. And back to, the fact that they might be able to speak English. How do you ask somebody if they speak English? You would just say habla inglés, and they'll say sí for yes or no for no. Let me see. I will actually include a link or two below, and then there's also Google Translate, which you can use to practice. Duolingo is an app that you can use to practice, and it has a bunch of different levels. So you can always start at level 1. The trip is coming up soon, so you could just practice, greetings. and little things like, you know, where's the bathroom, which I'll go over in a second. Let me see. I have a little list here, my little cheat sheet. I'm sorry, lo siento. Bump into somebody or whatever. You just, you know, I'm sorry is lo siento. Excuse me, you can say con permiso, or you can say perdón. I don't speak Spanish. No hablo español. No hablo español. Or you'll hear me tell people all the time, no habla español muy bien. I don't speak Spanish very well. You'll also hear me say, please speak slower. So I'll say that by hable despacio, por favor. Please speak slower. Repita, por favor. If you don't understand something that somebody said, you can always ask them to repeat themselves. Repita, por favor. What's your name? I can't even speak English. ¿Cómo se llama? Me llama es Yolanda. Let's see. You're shopping and you want to know how much something costs. ¿Cuánto cuesta? ¿Cuánto cuesta? Let me see. Can you help me? ¿Me podría ayudar? Where's the bathroom? ¿Dónde está el baño? So, you know, again, that should get you started. Practice makes perfect. If you want to... If you want to use some of the websites down below, you can just hit play on them and just practice a couple of times before we leave. You know, I was looking at one that said, where's the bank? Just to remind people that at Cuba, there are no ATMs. So you will have to bring cash with you, you know, that you plan on spending on the trip. As far as dressing, you know, Latin countries tend to be conservative with dress. You might see all those nice sexy dances, which are beautiful, but as far as the culture, it's conservative. So we want to be respectful of that. And I will be sending out some more information about the trip. If you have any questions, please make sure you put them down in the comments so that we can get that information out to everybody. If you have any question, don't hesitate to ask. You know, there are no like silly over-the-top questions. We want people to have as much information as possible. Again, I look forward to going. I will be seeing you guys in a couple of weeks. And until then, be safe, and I hope you enjoy the holidays.